can we start with introductions?
Sure. I guess we can do city staff first, then committee members, and then Echo. You guys can go. Okay, so I'll start first. Mary Hepperling Creighton, housing planner for the city of Newburgh, and also the staff liaison for the Affordable Housing Commission and project manager for the housing production strategy.
And Doug Rux, community development director.
All right, Larry, you want to go?
Sure. Larry Hampton. I guess I'm the chair or whatever it is called of the Affordable Housing Commission.
All right, Joyce.
Joyce Del Rosario. I am a commissioner on the Affordable Housing Commission, a student, and also serving as vice chair and serving as a member of this housing production strategy.
Melissa Daly. I am on the Housing Production Strategy Advisory Committee, and I'm on another committee. Sorry, I can't remember what it is. There's so many. And I work for the Housing Authority of Washington County in the Housing Services Department, doing work with affordable housing.
Newburgh's a little bit out of Washington County, isn't it? You're not representing Washington County's Housing Authority. Thinking, hold on, I'm in Yamhill.
No, that's just where I work. There's not really, until Mary had her job, there were not really many affordable housing jobs to be had in Yamhill County.
That makes sense. I apologize, I was confused. I'm Beth Goodman. You guys are clearly, I can recognize that you're in Yamhill and not Washington County. So obviously you can tell you're very lucky to have me as a consultant. I'm laughing at myself. I'm a project director here at Echo Northwest. I've worked with Doug on a number of projects related to housing and housing need in Newburgh. So I'm very pleased to be here. And Leanne?
Hi everyone, I'm Leanne Ryan. I'm a project manager at Echo Northwest and the project manager for this project on our end. So I'm excited.
And we're lucky to have Leanne with us also. So Mary, is it okay if I talk through the agenda for a moment?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so what we wanted to start with was a brief review from the last meeting of unmet housing needs, so we can get the definitions and agree on them and make sure that everybody is on the same page, basically. And then some discussions about potential housing strategies to meet the housing needs. And we'll go over the questions that we're hoping to answer with those. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the project here in a moment. Give me a moment. I'm gonna try to share my screen in just a moment. And walk you through a little bit of our schedule and pardon me, adjusting so that I get to keep all of you on my screen also. Okay, can everybody see my my PowerPoint? Lovely, lovely PowerPoint.
Yes.
So the project schedule goes on through next spring, and we've got a total of 6 meetings. They're the turquoise colored meetings, where we'll start off with contextualizing housing need. That's presenting with a range of information about housing need in Newburgh. And then here the next few months, we're talking about what should Newburgh do about those that housing need, and how can it best meet that housing need through different strategies. And we'll talk about some of those today. We'll revisit them again in July, and we'll revisit them again in October and November, making sure that we've got the right strategies, we've got the right information, that kind of thing. And in the end, by next winter, you will have in your hands the draft housing production strategy with a lot of details about each of the strategies in it. So that is where we are going. You can see we've got interactions with the City Council planned, as well as interactions with the Planning Commission. We've got one open house planned for later next winter to discuss with people some of the strategies. We've also got some public engagement, which I haven't read the scope for the last few minutes, so I'm not prepared to talk about public engagement in detail unless we need to. And then we'll have to get that document open. But we've got stakeholder interviews, that kind of thing, as part of this. So we'll be asking different service providers and developers about some of the policies that we're looking at and whether they seem to be the appropriate policies to support Newburgh in supporting more development of housing and especially affordable housing. Does anybody have any questions about that very quick project overview? Okay. So then a brief review about housing needs. So this is very much cutting to the chase, and a lot of data was presented in the last PowerPoint, if you want to look at that. When we talk about housing at the very highest level, we're talking about housing that's affordable based on income. And a household that is spending more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs is said to be cost burdened. So we're looking at housing affordability as spending less than 30% of your gross income on housing costs. And just to mention, that's a HUD standard that doesn't account for wealth, debts, or special costs. So it's not a perfect standard, but it's certainly the industry standard, if you will. When you talk about housing need, you're also talking about access to housing that meets the unique requirements of a household. So your household size and composition. So a one-person household has different housing needs than a, say, 5-person multi-generational household. Location of housing relative to work and school in areas with high opportunities. So services that people need, like medical services, grocery stores, access to transit, those kind of things. Characteristics of the unit in the neighborhood, we've just hit on those a little bit, but housing that, does what the household needs it to do in terms of it has enough rooms so that it's not an overcrowded household, it's in a safe neighborhood, that kind of thing. And the last, and what seems to me most ephemeral, but critical, is access to housing without discrimination. So fair housing, that also runs through this. And I'm going to ask, as I talk through these, if you have questions, you just wave your hands or raise your hand on Zoom. So when we talk about housing, starting with income, we think about it in these different categories of income. So we're starting with Yamhill County's median family income of $96,900. So a household that earns 100% of median family income, this is a household of 4, can afford $2,400 and $2,420 of rent. So $2,420 a month in rent. They can theoretically possibly afford a house with a value between about $340,000 and about $390,000. Here are some example occupations if it was a single person household and what those occupations earn. So as we look at your lower income households, those earning 50% or less of median family income, and again, this is for a family of 4, you're talking about $48,500 or $1,200 a month in rent. As you go up the income category, $77,000, about $1,900 in rent. So when we look at the median sales price in Newburgh, we're seeing about $443,000. A household would have to earn about $126,000 or 131% of median family income to afford these prices. So they would be in this income category here. And we'll look at Newburgh's households distribution in these income categories in a few moments. So that's the highest earning households. The average asking rent, which doesn't include utilities, is about $1,200 in Newburgh. When you put utilities on top of that, you probably raise it by another $200 at least. So you're talking about a household that earns somewhere between 50 and 60% of median family income. So these households here that are below median 50% of median family income can't afford the asking rent when you add in utilities. So they're unable to afford most market rate rents. The households between these two groupings are increasingly able to afford rents. But when you look at newly built housing, you don't see housing that's newly built that has rents that are as low as what we're talking about, generally speaking. So your newly built housing is going to be more affordable to households that have income above 80% of median family income. The only kinds of newly built housing that you get that are affordable to households below 50% are generally income restricted housing. So things that organizations like Melissa's would build or would support development of. So when we look at the income distribution in Newburgh, what we see is you've got about 19% of the existing households are in that highest income group at 1,500 households or so. And you see nearly 40% of the households are down here at the very low and extremely low income, below $48,000. What they can afford is housing that is generally publicly subsidized or income restricted. And then you have the remainder here in this in-between place in low income and middle income. And remember that housing that's newly developed is generally not affordable to this group with income below 80% of median family income. So that was a lot. If you have any questions, I'm happy to go into them. But as we talk about affordability and development of new housing, we'll use these income ranges and these affordability ranges. We'll also provide in the report a little more detail about how that varies by household size. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go on then. So this just pounds home the idea that you've got your income restricted housing, your middle income affordable housing, and then this project is really not talking so much about how to support development of your market rate housing. That's already happening, generally speaking. This housing that's affordable here between 180 and 120%, some of that is certainly happening. It may need a little bit of help, but not a whole lot of help. So this is just combining your existing households with your new households based on the forecast for new households in Newburgh over the next 20 years. So you can see what we're talking about over time. We're expecting some growth at all income levels because we're assuming that the distribution of households, the percentages in each of these income levels doesn't change over time, which is undoubtedly, not precisely correct, but it's a way to get at an idea of how many households we may be talking about in these different income groups. All right, that's just repeating that. And so then that's all by income. And then we have to talk about, oh, yes, ma'am. Melissa, you've got a question.
Yeah, something is happening with my screen where I couldn't see where that data was coming from. Did you guys pull? There it is. And did you pull the data, or are you going off of like PSU? I'm just curious.
So it's complicated. So this data here, we pulled this data from the Census Bureau, and we calculated these percentages and estimated this number of households. For this, these numbers here are the same. Those are all in the dark blue. Those are all from the census. This in the lighter blue is based on the PSU forecast for new housing units in Newburgh. I think, Doug, you can correct me. I think it was the 2022 to 2042, although it might have been the 2021 to 41 period. I'm not sure
I
that that.
think it was the 21 to 41.
Okay, so we used PSU's numbers. We estimated what that 20-year period would be, 21 to 41. And then we used these same percentages here, the 19, the 18, et cetera, and said, okay, for that number of new households, if we assume that 19% is in your extremely low income, et cetera, how many households is that approximately? And that's how we got it. So we're using the PSU forecast as the basis for how much growth Newburgh will have. And then we're doing some work with it. Does that explain it?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. All right. Pardon me. So how housing needs will differ by different groups. I think in the PowerPoint slides that we did last time, there's about 7 or 8 slides that support this. So I've boiled it down to this one slide. People experiencing homelessness. We've got the estimates here for Yamhill County. You can see that the numbers, change year by year. But there's quite a number of people experiencing homelessness in Yamhill County, and undoubtedly some of them are in Newburgh, and they probably move between communities. So the housing needs for people experiencing homelessness, when you look at incomes, overall, there's not great income data for people experiencing homelessness, but when you look at it overall, what you see is that the majority of people experiencing homelessness have income below 30% of median family income across the state. It's almost 90%. So people experiencing homelessness are generally low or no income households. So they need access to a housing unit that is affordable, but then some of them also need access to a housing unit that has services to address any mental health or substance abuse issues or other issues that the person or household may be experiencing. So affordable unit, possibly services, obviously housing, access to housing without discrimination. It's a complicated set of issues, and I'm boiling it down very quickly. When we look at people of color, and of course, the largest group of people of color is Latino. What we see is, generally speaking, not for all groups of color, communities of color, but say for Latinos, their income is below the average income. And so they have more trouble than the average household does affording housing because they have income lower. And so people of color, generally speaking, need housing that's affordable. They need a unit that meets their particular household's needs, in that some communities of color have larger household sizes on average and may have multi-generational households more frequently. They certainly need access to housing that is without discrimination. That's certainly a big consideration. There's some other details that are in the longer presentation. People over 65 and people with disabilities, I'll speak about these as 2 groups because their housing needs, while they do diverge somewhat, in my little summary, they're similar. Again, they and people of color typically have lower incomes, and I didn't mention with people of color, are disproportionately cost burdened. So they have higher rates of cost burden than the average household. People over 65 and people with disabilities, again, they need an affordable unit. They need access to housing without discrimination. Oftentimes they'll need access to housing, especially for people with disabilities, that meets their unique disability needs. So in other words, if you have a physical disability that is about, all I can think of is the word locomotion. It's so not the right word. Mobility, there's the right word. Mobility, then perhaps you need access to housing that has a ramp or has wider doors. Of course, people with cognitive disabilities will need different things and may need access to housing with services. The same thing is true for seniors who need care, access to housing with services. So there's a wide variety of needs. And in the HPS, I will not be talking about them as quickly. We'll do some work on this in parsing those out some. But as we're talking about the different strategies, keeping in mind that it's not just about income, that it's about more than income. So that's the point I'm trying to get across here. Before I go on, do you have any questions or comments? Okay. So in developing the housing production strategy, the point of the housing production strategy from a statewide planning system is that cities have a role to play in supporting housing development. And so the HPS, generally speaking, the actions, the major actors are the city. So as we're thinking about what strategies we should have in the HPS, thinking about what role does the city play in development? Well, where you have development that could occur, you've got the intersection of land that's available for development, public policy that supports that development, access to capital to pay for that development, and then market feasibility. Well, cities directly influence your public policy, such as your zoning and your density and your design requirements. And they have to be set so that a developer can build a profitable project. Cities also have an impact, have a role to play in land availability, making sure that there's enough land within the urban growth boundary, making sure that land has offsite infrastructure, or there are plans for getting offsite infrastructure to that land. And when I say infrastructure, I mean water, wastewater, stormwater, and roads. The city may not pay for those things. Those may be paid for at least partially by the developer, but the city may have a role, could have a role in paying for those. Cities rarely have a big role in access to capital unless you're talking about rehabilitation, so low income loans or low interest loans, that kind of thing. So capital isn't a place that cities generally play as big a role. And then market feasibility. There has to be the ability to build a profitable project. Cities can play a limited role in this, in looking at things like tax incentives or system development charge deferrals or backfilling, so paying them, that kind of thing. There's some role that cities can play in market feasibility. So as we're talking about policies, actions, strategies, keep in mind who our players are. Some of our HPS strategies could be that the city's acting as a partner, but those sometimes are, those strategies and how those are implemented are less in the city's control. So those can be things that city may not want to include in their HPS, even though the city wants to do otherwise. So here's a list of, or a diagram about types of strategies. So you've got your strategies that are less impactful. I think about these as things that are necessary, but not necessarily necessary, but insufficient to support development of housing in and of themselves. So things like producing informational resources, partnering to leverage efforts and resources. Partnering is critical, but it often doesn't result directly in development of housing. Removing regulatory barriers. There are some instances in which removing a regulatory barrier can result in development of housing, but oftentimes removing that barrier does not necessarily in and of itself result in housing, unless the barrier is a pretty egregious barrier. So up in the more impactful, we're talking about things that are related to resources like land or allocating money. So land and funds. So as we're talking about the strategies, this is sitting at least in the back of my mind. And there's the next steps, but I don't think we necessarily need to talk about that right now. So before we go on to talk about strategies, do y'all have any questions? I feel like I'm on fast forward. Okay, I'm going to take that as no, you don't have any questions. I'm going to set the PowerPoint aside. I know I'm telling you what I'm doing. It's a little bit weird. So we're going to discuss some of the potential strategies. And what I'm hoping to get out of this discussion is a better sense of what we should be bringing back for discussion in the next round of this. So I believe it's in July or so, when we're talking about strategies more. So what I'm looking for here is, with the strategies that we included in the memorandum that I'll bring up in a moment, what do you think of the ones that we identified are most important to include in the HPS? Are there anything that should not be included in the HPS? That'll be part of what we're doing here. And then are there strategies that aren't in the memorandum that should be included in the HPS? So essentially, I'm asking the first set of questions of, what do you think are good strategies? And we'll bring back more information. And what are we missing? And what just seems off the mark? All right. So set that over here. So the memorandum we gave you is, it's only 20 pages long, so it's not as long as some of them. I'm gonna show you this table. We'll be talking from this table. But remembering that as you look down here, there's information about many of the strategies, or about all of the strategies. So I might end up referring back to that. What we're going to do here, I'm going to set this off the screen, is Leanne's going to help us in writing down information from this discussion. So what we've got is we've got this table that is structured so that you've got your potential strategies. They're all here in white. We'll zoom in on them in a moment. Leanne, will you put a link to this in the chat? So if anybody wants to look at it directly, they can. We'll move some of these strategies down into include in the HPS. There may be some that people are a little dubious about, and we can move it to may include in the HPS. And then if there's any that don't seem to be appropriate, we can move them there. If as we're going along, you say, where's the strategy about thus and such? I was expecting to see that here and we don't have it. We can add it and discuss it. So that's kind of where we're going. And this builds off of the work that we did for the housing capacity analysis. I'll just mention things that were included in the housing strategy that we did for the housing capacity analysis. It also doesn't include all of the things that we included in the housing strategy, because the city has accomplished some things over the last few years. So for instance, developing code to support missing middle housing types. That's, I don't remember if that's adopted yet, Doug, or you guys are still in the process.
It is adopted as of
Okay.
January 6th of 2022.
So how about we start with regulatory strategies? And I'm going to end up having to ask staff some questions as we go through about what some of the issues are, because they'll know these better than I will. But we've got 4 strategies here around regulatory strategies. So expedited permit review, you often hear developers talking about that. You've got an existing density transfer policy to make residential clusters more feasible. It's a very specific item. We might look at expanding density bonuses, looking at establishing minimum lot sizes or minimum density standards, maximum lot sizes. And the way that that is important, I think I will start there because that's a graspable one. So your minimum density standards or your maximum lot sizes, those are important, especially in your zones where multifamily housing is allowed. So in your high density zones, you frankly want to discourage development of single family housing. Because you want to get more multifamily housing there. And so, Doug, can you talk a little bit about what the regulatory challenge is in Newburgh? And I just want to acknowledge that Joyce has joined us. Maybe. Oh, Joyce has left and rejoined.
She was moving down the road.
Leanne has turned off her screen. Okay, all right.
So I think the place to start is when we did the middle housing stuff, we did make some adjustments to our lot sizes. We didn't decrease our low density or medium density, but we did add stuff in for the other middle housing pieces. But we did have to look at some of the issues about the 1,500, we got a requirement of 1,500 square feet per dwelling unit is required. And so from there, kind of the question is, well, should that number be lowered or not if you're trying to maximize? So one of the things that our HCA identified is that we are deficient in multifamily land, in multifamily developments. So we were toggling from about 72% of our housing stock was detached single family homes, and we've toggled that down to about 60%. So that means more multifamily housing to occur in our limited supply that we are currently have. So if we're going to try to get this multifamily housing, should we adjust that minimum square footage required per unit so that we can get more of that multifamily housing given our height restrictions that we have? And when we did the middle housing stuff, we talked about increasing height. We didn't do it in the R1, we did it in the R2 and R3 zones, because part of that is just trying to truly get to a true 3-story apartment building. But there was also some conversations about, should we allow 4-story apartment buildings? The other piece of that is that we do have language in our code, and this kind of plays off of something that Beth said, is in our multifamily, we do, in our R3 zone, is that we do allow multiple single family, duplex, triplex, and quadplex, as well as multifamily dwellings and cottage cluster dwellings. But there we have a minimum dwelling size. Let's see, multifamily or cottage dwellings shall be developed at a minimum of 2,500 square feet per lot area. So that just is something we may want to look at. I mean, do we really want to have multiple single family development occurring in our R3? The triplex, duplex, triplex, and so forth.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there, do these connect to any parking requirements?
Yes.
Okay, where would
So,
I,
so we have a section in our code related to parking, and it's based upon the number of bedrooms that you have for multifamily. So as an example, I'll open that one up. So if you're doing a multifamily dwelling, if you have a studio or a 1-bedroom apartment, you have to have 1 off-site parking space. If you're doing a 2-bedroom unit, you have to have 1.5. If you're doing a 3 or 4-bedroom unit, you have to have 2 off-street parking spaces. If you have 5 or more bedrooms, then you have to have 0.75 per bedroom. But then we also have requirements for unassigned spaces. So at least 15% of your total required parking has to be unassigned. And then on top of that, we have another provision that says if you have more than 10 parking spaces on your lot, you have to provide an additional 0.2 visitor spaces per dwelling unit.
So does anybody have an opinion on this? This might be something that we need more the planning commission's weigh in on.
I'm just wondering, Doug, what's the reasoning behind no more than 3 stories in like in apartments or whatever?
It's the NIMBY, not in my backyard syndrome. So where we have those hard edges, where we have our multifamily land, which is really our R2 and our R3, is they butt up against R1 land, and the people in the R1 do not want to have towering structures in their backyards.
I was gonna speak up about the parking thing is I think it's probably fair to assume that if somebody's in a more dense area or in housing that is below market rate, their wage earning capacity could possibly be less. And so they might have more than one person in their house who has to drive further for a job to pay that rent. And so I think something I've seen, not here specifically, but in other places, is the assumption that apartment dwellers don't have one or two income earning people who are having to leave the house. The luxury of being a telecommuter and commanding the same wage didn't hit that demographic the same. So then my other piece about that was, if we're assuming no parking requirement, if that gets lessened because we're talking about a demographic that we're assuming doesn't own their own vehicles so much, I would still be interested in how close then those lessened parking requirements happen toward what we call public transit, or what the option was there.
Well, that's where we have a bit of a rub, because we do not have a robust public transit system in Yamhill County. We got the commuter that takes you into Tigard to get you into the Portland metro area. So that's a morning and an afternoon. And then we have some local service in some loops. In their transit master plan is in the future have 4 different loops, kind of the northwest loop, the northeast loop, the southeast loop, and the southwest loop. And, someday have a transit center somewhere in or around the downtown area, but it takes money to do all of that. So what we've run into in the past is a developer's trying to maximize the number of units that they can get on a developable portion of land. Abutting property owners are concerned about the height and the appearance. Then they get concerned about the parking. Is there enough parking for, because people will start, well, everybody's got 2 cars. Well, that's not necessarily true. But then parking overflows out onto the public street. And so when it overflows out onto the public street, they might park in front of somebody else's house. And that homeowner many times views that space that's in the public street is their private parking space, and others cannot park there. And so we continue to get complaints about apartment projects that are near single family development on those topics I just mentioned.
So I don't want to get too far down into the weeds of the regulatory strategies. Joyce, I couldn't quite tell if you were advocating for limiting parking requirements, because we really hadn't touched on changing those.
I was just clarifying that they were in fact tied to household composition. And if there was a pivot on that it was reflective of the economic opportunity and walkability score.
Yeah. Okay. So does anybody have an opinion about establishing, I'll just call it minimum densities for the sake of this? Is that something we should take through and bring back more information about where that would be, that kind of thing? Or do you see that as fundamentally problematic?
I think it would be helpful to see the different zoning areas where those are in Newburgh, because all I can do right now is sort of picture where I see new development around town and the houses are taller, and so yeah, what this would look like and where are the zones that would have the most impact and maybe be least offensive.
Okay. So Leanne, will you turn that one green and move it down into there we go, into that box? And these aren't decisions that we keep forever. These are decisions just to help us start weeding things down. So expanding density bonuses is really about choosing. Oftentimes it can be about choosing a housing type that you want to incent development of, such as affordable housing. When I say affordable, I could mean income restricted affordable, so affordable below 60% of median family income, or I could mean affordable that goes up to 80% of median family income. So that kind of housing that is, people will call it workforce, and I like to avoid that term because this is all workforce housing. You can get workforce at many different income levels, but it's that lower part of middle income. Do you offer those kind of density bonuses right now? I don't think you do, Doug.
We do not.
So what do you think about a strategy that looks at density bonuses tied to level of affordability, maybe at a mixed income development scenario, so that you have some units in your new multifamily buildings that are affordable, say below 80% or below 60% of median family income, along with some that may not be.
I have a quick question. Does this have anything to do with floor area ratios when they say density, or?
It could have to do with floor area ratios, but it doesn't necessarily have to be related to that. Floor area ratios are one measure of density.
Okay. The other measure we would be using is bedrooms per occupant per unit.
Dwelling units per acre.
Dwelling units per acre. Okay, thanks. So we're talking, all right, got it.
So
This
I have a
isn't-
question.
Go ahead.
I have a question on this more about, I mean, if I think about it in terms of trying to incent a market rate developer, I have a hard time believing that they're going to, one, produce these 80% units that, two, can be regulated. So that's going to fall on city staff. And are they really able, capacity wise, to do that? That sort of monitoring at the end is what one thing that I want to keep an eye on, versus regulated affordable housing that's, funded by the state and has all these other,
It's already regulated.
agencies involved that are going to make sure that they're following the 60% and below. So I think density bonuses for regulated affordable housing is great to an extent. I mean, how to limit that at what point, I'm not sure, but I think that can be very helpful, especially these days with, land costs and build development costs increasing so much.
Where you might use it, and it might work for market rate affordable at that 60 to 80%, say, is if you tied it in with a tax exemption like the MUPD, the multi-unit tax exemption, which we haven't talked about quite yet. But a lot of these things are going to have to be tied to other strategies, and we'll get to that in our next meeting in order to have results that are productive. Do you have a different opinion if it was tied to another strategy?
No, I mean, I think incentivizing affordable housing below 100%, below 80% AMI is great. Just, keeping an eye on the enforcement part of it. So I think your multi, it sounds like it would do that. So yeah, and that's it. I'm not against that at all.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask a question. Is there anywhere where they have to tie this bonus into demonstrated capacity of that area to receive even more bonus? Or do they just have to meet? So whether that was first responder services or the school district, or where do they, other than meeting, what are the criteria for the bonus?
You'd have to develop the criteria for this.
Okay.
For a lot of these, the answer is going to be the city needs to develop its criteria where it's going to allow density bonuses. So I think, noting that the criteria is an important piece of that is a fair thing to do. And I keep clicking on it and getting the wrong result. Um, all right.
Hey Beth, would say affordable housing development comes in and you allow them to go higher, like say an extra story, would that count towards a density bonus?
There would be a form of density bonus. That's one way you can allow that kind of density bonus.
Okay.
So what form your density bonus takes, if it's more smaller units or a taller building, that's all in the definition of the density bonus.
Right. Okay.
Joyce, you've got a question. It's okay.
Yeah. So what if the form of density bonus was, say, building housing for persons who are disabled that had the caregiver room? You know how like some they have some names are like
Yeah.
on-site support. Like, is that
I mean, that's an extra bedroom. I'm not quite sure that that's a density bonus in any of these typical ways. What would prevent a developer from building a 2-bedroom apartment rather than a 1-bedroom apartment? What would be the barrier to that is regulatory? I can imagine financial barriers. I'm not sure that there is a regulatory barrier there.
It seems like we could talk through all kinds of possible scenarios, but it seems like there's been enough question or raised with this that it's worth looking into and seeing if it's again, whether it's the height, whether it's the tax incentives or whatever, that it's worth moving down to the. Seems like we got lots of sticky notes and
we got lots of sticky notes, a lot to do. So we'll turn that one green for now. So expedited building permits, developers certainly always ask for that. We could do some in talking to developers, some questioning about whether there's particular issues with expedited building permits. I don't think that was something that came up in the housing capacity analysis. And I don't exactly remember why we added that one to this, other than it's certainly an oft asked for thing.
Seems to me like everybody asks for it, but is that really what's going to incentivize people to do affordable housing? They just want to move anything they do faster. I don't see how this is going to encourage.
It is harder to build housing affordably if your development process is particularly slow. And so maybe this is one that we slip down to the maybe or the no. And as we're talking to developers who are working in Newburgh, we ask the question of how much of this is an issue.
I would also say that in the infancy of all of these strategies being implemented, there will be clunkiness, but it talks about later how there's not a navigation center or any specific outreach services. So lacking that and lacking how many ways the public can keep up, I don't know that any more fast tracking is needed at this time. Okay. You might miss some opportunities.
Let's not talk about the density transfer policy. I think that's going to get really technical really quickly. Let's move into what I think is more interesting here, the strategies to support or increase housing options. So I'll start with what is well and truly a kind of easier one. Pre-approved plan sets for accessory dwelling units and missing middle housing topologies. Some cities are doing this. What it is if you say, I'm going to choose this pre-approved plan set and I'm going to build a duplex, then there's certain parts of the regulatory process you don't have to go through because you've done what the city says it wants to do. And I'm not sure how much in and of itself that's necessarily going to really push housing forward. But it certainly seems something that is very achievable and can be helpful. I'm not seeing much opinion, so I'm gonna move it down to the green.
That's
I,
fine.
I was just gonna say, I think that there are people who would be interested in ADUs if they really understood what was required of them, or there was like a place to go that said ADUs, how do I get one? What size does my lot have to be? Do
Yeah.
I need to buy another, pay for another, what is the water hookup? I'm blanking out, but that sort
Development
of,
charge, yeah.
if it led to this, like, if this sounds like you can have an ADU, like, I think it could lead into this.
Okay. So these two, which are very different from the others, support access to emergency shelter. We'd have to decide exactly what the city's role was in supporting access. The city, I don't think the city has been discussing building an emergency shelter itself. Mary's shaking her head. So this would be one about partnering. And is there an organization in Newburgh that's talking about building an emergency shelter?
So I was gonna say, not that I was aware of, and I would like to see, as far as quote supporting that, would probably be having some transparency shared with us about what shelter beds are within fair driving distance, and like some other community, sometimes you just have to get those agreement with transportation or cab companies, help actually get people to that shelter. So absent building a shelter that is within walking distance of the city, I think it would be fair to identify private vendors who can move these persons who are obviously having a hard enough time, as opposed to saying, this is the bus you should get on. Because if you're already dehydrated and hot and not having shelter, waiting for which bus and getting on that would be probably even more of a hard time. So I think absent having one, we should be concerned about transportation to them.
So I'm
Beth,
gonna ask.
Would
ahead, I'm
you, I know there's at least one church that is looking at developing some cottage clusters for transitional housing, working with Providence. Would that fit under what you're talking about here? I mean, it's not really a shelter in the same way, but it is, it's not permanent housing.
But it's important housing. That's not exactly what this is, but I'll come back to that. And Larry, if I don't come back to that, please bring that up again.
Are we using the under 90 days as the term? Are we using that like as a form of like what you mean by shelter? Like it's so short term that it's like 90 days or less, not ever expected to lease up there?
I don't think we were using a very official definition with this, but it is certainly not long-term housing. It
So
is
I think-
exactly what it's called, emergency shelter.
So I saw the two different forms of emergency shelter. One could be the inclement conditions and the weather, but they also could be a domestic violence situation or fire, right? And so I guess I was just wondering about in all those situations, I know we can sometimes ask Red Cross to help us with emergencies, but if it's not a declared emergency.
I think this is not the wildfire emergency. This is the other type of emergency shelter. So what I'm hearing is some interest in this and desire for more information about what form this support might take with the city. All right. So a navigation center. So a navigation center is something that helps people experiencing homelessness, provides them with services, may provide them with, a temporary place to store belongings, may have other characteristics. I think, talking about developing a navigation center is of course something that the city council would have to be on board with. Mary or Doug, has any discussion been going forward about a navigation center specifically?
In Newburgh, I'm not aware. There have been discussions out in McMinnville.
So I think that's, I would put this under the broader class of, while we're not talking about housing that is specific for low-income households experiencing homelessness, another way of supporting those households. And I think somewhere here, we should have a strategy that is specifically about supporting housing that is income restricted, be it permanent supportive housing or other housing. And if it's not on here, we'll get it on here.
So when you're talking navigation center, are you meaning a place with pamphlets, or are you meaning a staff person receiving, phone calls and doing consultations with people? Because it does seem like we're a pretty small area, and at the end of the day, all this stuff involves money. Like if we're talking about, supporting emergency shelter or developing a navigation center, and if we're talking about people and staffing something like this, working with I just do not know what's happening with homelessness in Yamhill County as far as those type of supports. So partnering or, looking at contracting to do that. And I don't know if there's a reinventing the wheel that's happening or just a wheel we need to join.
That was my same concern about the access to emergency shelter. Is there a provider out there that the city is already working with, or a vendor that's approved? Do we not have a culturally specific or appropriate vendors doing this that the city wants to get involved in?
You don't tend to have vendors so much as nonprofit organizations who are struggling to do this kind of thing.
I think that's the word I meant to say.
Okay.
Like a contract would be a word to a nonprofit to do this for us.
Think about this as, does the city want, there isn't, to my knowledge, does the city want to push forward on this, or are there maybe other priorities that we should be looking at, like development of income restricted housing, some that may be permanent supportive housing, et cetera, et cetera.
That's the thing, as I think about these things, I mean, they all would be good in some place and some time, but all take resources, whether it's people's time, staff time, money, all kinds of things like that. So yeah, I'm just a little worried that we're gonna say, oh, all these, each one, oh, that's good, we should consider that, and then we're gonna have this huge group that we really can't do.
No, that is fine. That is part of what we're trying to get here.
Yeah. So this to me is not probably a priority from the city side. I think there are efforts, again, from churches and from nonprofits and stuff in Newburgh to do some of this and to work together.
It's okay, Larry. Let's for the moment move that down to a no.
I would just say, for me, I would take the navigation center over the emergency shelter because it's less direct services and more.
Navigation centers often have emergency shelter also.
Oh, so it would have been right, because they would have made a pass.
Similar.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I guess for where I would come from, that one is the one I thought would provide more equitable access of anything we were doing. And I didn't see it as a brochure place. I saw it more as an online resource that had an email address associated with it and some frequently asked questions. And then maybe somebody lands on a waiting list somehow for some reason. But it did seem like the production strategy would beget a information tool that kind of took care of itself. Pretty static stuff. A lot of, and it's pretty and the work on that would have been, it's pretty mobile friendly, because some people don't have laptops, they just have their phones. And so it'd be a really, really simple format is what I saw, not as dynamic yet as what you were talking about, but yeah, the pathway to it. Yeah. And then you would, the McKinney-Vento liaisons would know that it's there for the city if any of their kids like age out.
So producing informational resources. Okay, why don't we put that one down into keep, and then put the navigation center away for now. I'm gonna hop over to a really different topic. Let's see. Well, let's hop over to a topic that is related. Preserving regulated affordable rental housing. What this is often about is your regulated affordable rental housing. At some point, your your low-income housing tax credits run out. And then the housing might transition into income, not income restricted housing, just into market rate housing. And so this is, at least in part, one form of it is tracking that, and then working with your existing owners to see if you can get new low-income housing tax credits and recapitalize that development so it stays low income over the long term. A more assertive version of that that starts to blend into the next one is what if you purchased, you being the city, purchased that housing as it became market rate and then preserved it for low-income rental housing. That's essentially what this other one does.
So, I mean, this is a little bit like in the realm of what I work in, and
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that preserving regulated affordable housing is one of the most important things we can do. In the state of Oregon, it's harder to build new housing and more expensive than to take something that's already existing as affordable and keep it that way. So, I mean, at a minimum, coming up with that list of what those properties are within Newburgh would be really helpful. And I think finding, if there is an owner who wants to sell, finding a nonprofit owner. I don't know if the city wants to get into the, rental business. That is just a can of worms. That's my opinion. But the state is also looking at this regularly. There are so many properties that this is happening to, but definitely like being aware of what's in your community and being, I mean, I'm wondering, is the city, or would it be the Housing Authority of Yamhill County or the county? What agency receives those notices from the state when a property is going to go out of affordability? I think it's a 2-year notice that is sent out.
And the city can also proactively look at that list.
No, they're listed on something that was, I can picture the form in my head, but it's.
I'm pretty sure that OHCS maintains a list that is available.
Right, I'm sure the list gets pretty short once you get to Yamhill County and then, down into
It's
our
different than Washington
cities.
County. Yeah.
Right.
So is there a LIHTC map then that shows us the active tax credit properties with the details? I thought there were like tax credit maps, but do we not have one for our area?
There probably are, but or one could create them. That kind of information is out there. So I mean, part of this, if it was important to do, I don't know how many tax credit properties are in Newberg. In Tualatin, for instance, there were only 2. So mapping it would have been really unexciting. And there's some downsides to mapping it because then you're identifying, publicly where you have income restricted housing and there's probably some concerns with that. But on the other hand, it's not like it's invisible. In other words, not known. So why don't we take this one and move this one down to here and go on to talk about preserving the existing, you might call this naturally occurring affordable housing. So this isn't your income restricted. This is your other housing that's affordable in your community. And part of what this takes is knowing what housing is in your naturally occurring supply. So, having that kind of knowledge and then having connections with the owners of that kind of housing so that if they're looking at selling, the city gets some notice of that because they have that relationship with you. And then there's a part about essentially the city facilitating that. In other words, seeing if there is a developer who'd be interested, or an owner who'd be interested in purchasing the housing.
Yeah, to me, that's that, and that goes along with the manufactured home, mobile home park one for me. Because I know in Newburgh, a large part of what currently exists is in manufactured homes. It seems, I believe. So, but to me, both of those two are ones that we should look into doing what we can.
And the preserving manufactured and mobile homes, that's oftentimes, again, something that might happen with private individuals where the city is playing a more minor role in that. And maybe we roll these two into one strategy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So are the manufactured and mobile homes, they are not built to last as long. That's kind of the idea, right? So they,
Older ones especially.
okay. So do we, knowing how many people are living in those, were we already having a plan of meeting up with that prior to this strategy, meeting up with all those, helping all those kind of that demographic of people deal with their home repairs or keeping up before this? Or is this a new, I think you did it with block grants.
Yeah, so we got a CDBG grant in 2016. So that was a grant that we did repairs and so forth on manufactured homes and manufactured home parks. We just got another grant for $500,000 for the same program.
So that's already existing.
Yep.
So we're gonna keep those two and probably roll them together a little bit. So the restrictive covenants, that would really come in if the city was specifically supporting development of affordable housing. So I would leave that one off the list for right now, and we can bring it back if we need to a little bit later. The inspections of short-term rentals, that's STRs, or considering restrictions. The city currently regulates short-term rentals, I believe, and requires them to be licensed. I'm asking
Yes.
a question. Okay. And so the question is there more of an issue in the community where there's a lot of concern about short-term rentals? Where it's affecting short-term rentals if the whole unit is for rent and it's year-round. It takes housing out of the market for year-round renting. It can also be in some communities an issue related to quality of life. Do you have a sense of whether there's a big amount of concern around short-term rentals?
I would say there's a growing concern,
I was just gonna say exactly the same thing. Yeah.
and we are consistently seeing vacation rental applications in the planning department.
Some cities restrict short-term rentals quite a lot. Let us say this is not my personal opinion. I occasionally stay in vacation rentals. But you know, the city of Hood River doesn't allow them except when you're just renting out a room. The city of Newport, I know only allows so many and in certain locations. So there's a wide range of opportunities for restrictions. So maybe we move this down into the maybe or the yes. And maybe this is something we take up a little more with the Planning Commission.
I'd vote for a yes. As a homeowner, I feel like when we're starting to see the effects, it's already too late.
Mhm. Okay. I'm fine with moving that down into the yes also. I'm gonna take us over here. So, and I can see that we've got one or two things missing off of here that we'll get in here. So strategies to lower the cost of development. One of the big ones that a lot of cities use is we've put them into two into one here, developing a land bank strategy. And so that could be identifying publicly publicly owned land that's surplus, that where housing could be developed. It could be the city buying land and assembling it for housing development. And then in most cities, the housing, most cities don't do the housing development themselves. They convey that land to, say, a nonprofit or the housing authority or somebody who's actually doing that development. And it's generally speaking, income restricted housing. So it's very affordable housing. When I talk about that, oftentimes, not always, I'm talking about rental housing. So as you start looking at ownership housing, that's when you bring in a land trust. So the question is, with affordable ownership housing, how do you keep that housing affordable over a long period? A land trust is one way to do that. You can also have, as part of that same strategy, one option for that is a cooperative housing model, so that you've got limited equity that is taken out of the unit. So I buy a unit for $100,000 because I can do the math. And 5 years later, the unit is worth $200,000. And the agreement is I get a certain amount of that extra $100,000 out when I sell. Maybe I get $25,000 out or whatever the right number is. But the rest of that equity stays with that house. And so now it doesn't cost $200,000. Now it costs $125,000. I'm simplifying things grossly. But that's what's trying to be achieved with keeping ownership housing affordable over the long run. In my opinion, and I will express my opinion, land banking part and land trust, they could be together, they could be separate. Those are pretty powerful tools. And we could, work in the idea of a cooperative housing model as, a variant of a land trust. It's not really the same thing at all, but.
I like Habitat in Newburgh has been, the last couple of houses or properties were, some of the funding we've gotten requires that the land stay in a trust for 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, whatever, for affordability, which changes our model a bit, but it is, it's helpful in buying the land and building. It seems in Newburgh, we're just so limited for land, period. I just have a hard time seeing how this would work in Newburgh. I'm all for the idea, but I just with how limited we are with what land is even available, it's hard for me to see. And I could be convinced maybe that it's doable, but that's my question.
Well, I'll give you an example. A place that is even more limited for land is Hood River. They really don't have land, and they really can never expand their urban growth boundary given the Columbia River Gorge and other things. And what they've managed to do is the city used funds from its construction excise tax to purchase some land that it is working with developers right now on planning for income restricted. I think it's actually a mixed income development, but some of it will be income restricted. So Larry, that is an answer to your question of, I can't imagine where. I suspect there are small opportunities at least.
Well, and I know there's some things in the works, maybe for some, again, you tried to not use the word workforce housing, with some organizations in town looking at working together to build some housing for their workforces. And one of them in particular has some land, to do that. But yeah, again, it just seems like any land that's available is so expensive, and unless you unless it's little pieces that are really hard to build on. And the city has some history. There was a small piece of land that, again, they gave to Habitat to build on, didn't need it anymore. And so I guess I can see it more in little places here and there. I just have a hard time imagining it here being a big answer to anything.
I have this.
Go ahead, you first, Melissa.
Oh, sorry. I have the same, I guess, I mean, I wouldn't call it a hesitation, just question about like how much land is out there that we would even, have a chance at. But then I realize, we can think of redevelopment too, possible lot consolidation. So it's not impossible. Like you mentioned, there's if Hood River can do it, we can do it. But building up the funds to be able to actually be in the game and be able to purchase the land too, that would be like prioritizing what we're doing already and to use the funds for that.
Yeah, so I see this useful if you're a nonprofit trying to gather about you scattered sites, or you're a development group that's trying to pick up pieces for a larger policy issue. Like say you're trying to make a certain type of housing and the market isn't exactly right. It gives you a chance to build that inventory, hold on to it, and then deploy it when the policy matches the project. So I think because of the quote scattered and low inventory, if we don't use the longer term lens of providing some of those, reserving some of those for a trust or for the intent of banking them, was I guess what I was describing earlier. There are going to be, I don't see many I see that the inflation is moving faster than our opportunities to make a lot of decisions. And I feel like there's a rush to make decisions to build on land even before we might have the nonprofit involved that could get rid of, like, make that thing pencil, because there's, go get the land and build on it. So I think that it's also sends the message that we have longer term strategies that can align and wait on relationships being built.
And that reminds me, I keep trying to mention that an HPS is an 8-year action plan. So can we move the developed land bank and endorse the cooperative model, put them together, I think, down into the include, and part of what we'll need to do in that is acknowledge the scarcity of the opportunities. And it may be that through some of the discussions here, I mean, I've seen stranger things happen where opportunities are identified. So I'm gonna move us on to the 2 tax exemptions that we've got on the list here. Mary, can you confirm for me? I seem to remember that that the city just plain implemented a tax exemption recently, or was in the process of implementing one, but maybe I'm confusing this with a different city.
We don't have either of those, the Holtz.
What
or
about the low
multi.
income nonprofit, low income tax?
We do have that, yes.
Okay, so that's why that is not on the list. The 2 different tax exemptions we're looking at here, one of them is the multiple unit limited tax exemption. It's used in places like Portland. It's also used in places like Eugene. Newport's used it. A number of other cities are adopting it. What you do as the city is you identify an area where it's often called MUPTI rather than multi, but where it applies. You identify criteria for when it could apply. So for instance, Eugene says it has to be mixed income development where some percentage of the units in the building are going to be affordable at 80% or less of median family income. And then the city can choose to grant the exemption or not based on the development plan. So Eugene, for instance, one of its requirements is that that the developer submit a pro forma that proves, or at least demonstrates, that the development wouldn't happen without the tax exemption. And that's a very Eugene specific sort of thing. This is for multifamily housing, and it's for housing that is affordable for rental housing at below 120% of median family income. It can be granted for up to 10 years. So we can bring back some information about what if the city granted that tax exemption, and let's talk about what if there was a development or two that took advantage of it. What would the impact be on city revenues? We can bring back that kind of information as well as more description of what it is. Yes, ma'am.
The only reason I'm not as favorable toward this one is it doesn't incentivize the developer to partner with any community base. It just lowers their costs, and then they can come back later and say, oh, I didn't have enough money to do the wrap services for all these affordable housing, or I don't see where all it does is lower their costs, and they don't have a commitment outside of that.
Well, what they're committing is to charge lower rents for at least the time of the development. This is not the kind of housing where you get the kind of services that you're talking about, the wraparound services.
I don't mean full PSH. I just mean like even like a daycare facility, just anything that acknowledges these would be people of a lower income that would have a harder time getting market rate daycare or getting to any of the market rateness. It looks like it just lowers costs.
It does lower costs in exchange for lower rent in some units. So my point here is really, you don't have housing that's built that's affordable in this income range without some sort of incentive.
So this could take a building and have a chunk of it become affordable that would otherwise not have been.
So
it doesn't have to be the whole building.
No, it often isn't the whole building.
Got it. It's a chunk. Okay, that's great. Okay, I get it.
And then
Worthwhile, I don't know if it would incentivize anyone enough. It would be interesting to see.
It doesn't generally in and of itself. It has to stack with multiple different things. So the other tax exemption that we're talking about here, the home buyer opportunity limited tax exemption, that is for home buyers. It again lasts for 10 years. And gosh, I don't remember all the details about the exact level of affordability for it, but it's a small incentive. And where I would use Hulti is if I was looking at some development that was happening, say, with a land trust, where you know that housing is going to stay affordable, because after the housing is sold for the first time, Hulti would still apply, and not many cities use Hulti. As I understand it, it's more complex. Portland implements Hulti, but they don't track whether affordability stays past the first home buyer because it's so administratively complex. But there aren't all that many things that help get you. People talk about, oh, I want to see a lot more home ownership opportunities for people at, say, the 80% of median family income. Well, they can't begin to afford to buy most housing, even if it's smaller housing. That's often outside of the cost considerations. Things like land banking and land trusts, specifically land trusts, Hulti, those kind of things, those can move affordability a little bit. But getting affordable home ownership housing is just really expensive.
I think until we have a program that's addressing producing affordable home ownership opportunities, this isn't really worth your effort unless there's something I'm missing.
Can you convert a renter to a home owner?
Well, it depends on the type of unit. I mean, if it's in a multifamily rental building, you can't.
I guess
but
where my question is any renter potentially a home owner if they know about some of these things? Like even if they can't stay in that unit, maybe they can rent long enough to save, and then knowing that this was available, they would be able to buy a house or not based on something like it would affect that.
Holte is not going to move it like that,
Mhm,
not
mhm.
on its own.
It would have to come with a couple other things that help that person go through their home ownership preparedness.
Yep.
Okay.
So let's move multi down into the include and bring back. And Holte, should we put it on the don't consider for now? If it comes back, we can always move it back. So then our last two things are, one of them is reducing system development charges for regulated affordable housing. That is for housing that's affordable at less than 60% of median family income. The city will have to backfill the system development costs from another source. The city has CET, from what I understand. And so that is one way that CET could be used. And system development charges can be in the hundreds of $1,000s for multifamily developments. And this is, if you're going to give up that kind of money, I say you go for really affordable units.
Yeah, I mean, this was certainly one of the things we talked about when we talked about construction excise tax and putting it in place. So, we haven't revisited yet and decided exactly how we're going to use those funds. But to me, both of these that are left are things we should have on our plate or tool belt or whatever. And both are possibilities for use of CET money to backfill to me. So
As is the MUPD tax exemption. You can use that to backfill that. So shall we move those two down?
Yeah, Beth, I like your idea of doing the SDC, these waivers for, maybe a percent of the property there's the very low income or ELI extremely low income.
Mm-hmm.
Because the more I work on tax credit projects, the more I see how much money is really there and to be spent. And there's a part of me that really wonders why the city must, or, whatever government agency, county, whatever it is, has to be the one to absorb those costs when everyone else has their hand out getting paid. And so, I mean, Newburgh's pretty small. And so waiving those fees on a large project, I don't know if I really see the benefit. I see it in a large city like Portland, but even working in Washington County, where I'm just like, I don't know, man, waiving $1 million for a project that's 20 million or 25 or 30, like $40 million. I'm like, well, why do we have to take the hit? Like they don't do that here, by the way, in this large county. So I just, there's a lot of there's more subtleties involved in it than just waive or don't waive, I think, especially in a small community.
Should we focus on that then for the deeply affordable, the regulated units?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just think parsing it out a little more, and maybe it's projects that don't use tax credits. There's not a lot of them, or maybe it is like you're saying, the low, maybe the 30% units, or I don't know.
Maybe it is, a percentage of the units or something like that.
Yeah, or just a percentage of the fees, like something showing local support is better than nothing, but is the local support maybe funding from the CET?
Mm-hmm. So I want to move us on. I know Leanne's got your idea, and those are good points. Part of what I've got two important ones to go through first, but part of what I'm realizing that we don't have is a strategy on supporting development of income restricted housing. And that might be encompassed by some of what we're talking about, but I'd like to make sure that we're we're talking about that, and we talked about the different types of permanently not, the different types of income restricted housing, like the permanently supportive, et cetera. So are you okay with me adding that on, and we'll make sure that that idea is in there? I think we kind of, at the next meeting, part of what we need to do is look at how these strategies all array under what are essentially different goals. And one of the goals may be about supporting income restricted housing. And see if we have any essentially holes in what we're talking about. Oh my gosh, I cannot type, and I know it's not permanently. I just always say that. So I was seeing some nods. Will you turn that one green for me? Then we've got two other things to discuss. I'm going to go on to the easier one first, about supporting equity. Housing equity. So the easiest thing in here is, and this may not be a strategy, this may just be something that is a recommendation, is about adopting some policy or a policy around affirmatively furthering fair housing as a comprehensive plan policy. And then with that, the city might have a role in ensuring that there's education, referral, and other services for fair housing. So it may well partner, say, with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon to put on those educations events.
Yeah, I was just gonna say a lot of like smaller landlords, especially as they're gonna move and dabble into their ADUs and all these workation units. A lot of them have no idea how to receive a request for a reasonable accommodation. And they think that they're like small enough that they don't have to. So I don't think without education and some templates, they're gonna even think it applies to them.
So maybe we, the policy is a one-time sort of thing, but the education is the ongoing piece of that strategy.
Because if I have one unit versus 3 units, I might think, when I had my 1 unit, it didn't matter. But when I started having a couple more, I didn't realize I stepped up. So just that warning ahead of time or whatever.
So this next one, I would like either Mary or Doug to talk about this a little bit, but it's partnering with businesses and government for housing solutions through the Newberg Workforce Housing Consortium.
Jump in on this one. So we have spent the last couple of years working with some of our key businesses about a form of a partnership. Because we have businesses who are challenged that their workforce cannot live here and work here. They can't afford it. And so we've got healthcare and manufacturing and education have been involved in these discussions. There's momentum. We actually got some funding from the legislature last session. And so we are now embarking on a process to try to find what kind of legal structure this loose consortium would be. Strategic Economic Development Corporation is the one who's actually the grant administrator of those funds. They've received the funds on the behalf of Newberg. So it's a growing issue. We've talked with other companies who would like to get involved in this. This is not like your company town concept. This is, you may have an entity that says, we would commit for the next, 10 years, 5 units in this project. And then they would have their own kind of system where they might provide some subsidies to their workers to help pay for the cost of those particular units. That's the general concept.
So if I own a business and I know I'm paying people at a rate of say less than $40,000 a year, even if they're working full time, this would allow me to participate in some housing planning for that group of people, I know I'm not going to basically pay over 80% of the AMI.
That's one of the variables, yes. So it's something that's unique. I'm not sure, where Beth might have some knowledge of other communities have tried to work this way with their employers to try to have some kind of partnership to develop a project. So this could be with a housing developer, it could be with companies, it could be with a landowner. So you could have a landowner who's contributing the land, the developer who's getting low income tax credits and other financing. And then you're bringing in local businesses who are making some commitment, could be cash into the project or commitment to, we will rent these number of units guaranteed for the, X number of years, which then translates back to those workers providing a housing opportunity for them locally.
Doug, there are lots of cities that have done something like this, but they're also very different. And so they're all unique. This seems like a really Newberg unique strategy that we may want to just work on developing. What would this be more? And this project is an opportunity for pushing those conversations forward, and maybe it'll result in a strategy. But if it doesn't, it won't be for lack of consideration.
Looks like I'm seeing some head nods.
Okay. So then we're getting a little bit short on time. This last one is one that I worry about a little bit, but it's the idea that you develop a framework, a lens for making policy choices that are really focused on social and racial equity. And then you filter your policy choices that you're going to make through that lens. It's abstract, but it's also, I think, really potentially powerful if a city considered it. I'm not sure if Newburgh is ready for it.
Would this be like having renters have a chance? Like, is that when they say social equity, we're talking about people who are falling in this affordable housing class, knowing that they have some ability to interact in the feedback? Like, is that what they're saying?
This, like I said, this is abstract. This could be, I'll talk about our equity lens that we work with when we're deciding what projects to take, for instance. So we consider, who's going to benefit from it, who's going to be hurt by it. And we've got some guidance internally that we've agreed to. It's really informal still at the company in a lot of ways, but for what is it called? Environmental justice, we just don't work for gas companies, petroleum companies. If I was going to sit down and write down what our lens is for equity, sort of broadly speaking, and justice, it would involve that kind of thing. So it may well be that you have a lens that is about, you must consider how this may impact, it's just so abstract because it can happen in different ways, but how this may impact low-income households. You might have a policy that focuses, you have to collect this kind of data about the people who would be impacted by this sort of decision.
So I guess what I was thinking about that is in order to have enough diverse perspectives to do any kind of policies for the greater community, if we have recruited to that team the diversity of those perspectives, and so we have someone speaking from that group, then and we give them agency, then you kind of have a built-in lens from a historically maybe underserved or disadvantaged population. What I see here in Newburgh as kind of the most disparate forms are if you don't speak English really well, or you're not a homeowner. Anyway, there's other forms of social and racial equity, but that tends to be what I see. So it seems like a really simple solutions to that is to make sure you have diverse leaders, and that if it is something that's educational to the larger community, we put it out in the other language too, which Newburgh is great at.
So is this something?
Well,
what-
Beth, and I guess I'll maybe, I mean, I work for the school district, and so I don't know if you read the papers, but I assume that that's why your comment about not sure if Newburgh's ready for that. I mean, I think it's awesome. I think we should definitely use these lenses as much as we can. I think about half of our population believes that, and about half of our population right now does not. So what does that mean for us? You know, do we not do it because there's a bunch of people that will fight it? Or do we say, let's put it in here because we think it's the right thing to at least consider? And, you know, I would tend towards that, to at least to not just disregard it because of issues that we're having, but to at least consider it as a possibility.
So we'll move it down into a yes for now. What we'll do with it next time is I will get my our person who does a lot of this kind of work to help flesh out what this would be. So I have better words for it next time. All right, so I'm going to move us on to the last two. These are not the least important two. In a certain sense, these are some of the bigger ones. The city is already discussing urban renewal. And every time you tell me, Doug, I forget where you are in the urban renewal planning. Do you have the plan established already, or are you still establishing the plan?
Plan has been established, ordinance has been adopted, it goes into effect tomorrow.
Okay. All right, so, and in that plan, there is a plan for a certain amount of public infrastructure to serve housing.
That
That
is
is
correct.
just a gimme sort of, you're already planning for it. You should put that in your yes. And then as you implement your urban renewal, you would be also meeting that housing production strategy. I think it fits the spirit of the HPS as well as the letter. And we can discuss that more in what we'll bring to you next time.
Yeah. Can I would, the other one here, and again, there's been a little bit of discussion about that's another use for CET money, is to pay, you know, do a bond and pay for it that way. You know, to me, that pairs with the develop the land bank or those kinds of things. I mean, I think that makes it way more possible.
Okay.
To do that is if we had, you know, a bigger chunk of money that a bond could give you to do that.
So we'll move that down into the yes. One of the things I think we should consider is at least a back of the envelope calculation of what might that bond, what size might that be? And I suspect that Doug can help us guide based on any recent bonds, so that we're not saying $5 per $1,000. I'm not going to say that anyway. I can't. So then my last question for you. I don't think we have any public comment here, do we?
We
Mary?
had,
We have a person, I don't know if they want to, if they have any public comments, but if you do, feel free to use the raise hand function. You can provide any public comment, but it's not required.
So as they decide if they want to comment or not, we've got a number of things that we moved around. Have we missed anything? Are you like, why haven't we talked about the thing that hasn't been talked about? I don't want to give Melissa extra power, but since she is in this industry,
Nothing's coming to mind. I mean, you guys have a pretty thorough list, and Newberg's already done some great things too. So
There was the mention that Larry brought up about the transitional housing. Did we want to put that anywhere?
So Larry, what would that look like? What would the city need to do to support that?
I mean, I think the city is supporting it in a lot of ways, just and some of it is just the middle housing stuff, and and making cottage clusters something that can be considered in places. Some of it is just kind of being willing to talk us through things because it's all new, and it's a new thing. And a lot of this stuff is kind of a new thing for the city, and it's a new thing for us that are doing it. And so, being willing to consult back and forth, but in general, supporting this idea of we need transitional housing. That's a piece that is missing in Newburgh. So,
and I would put that onto the income restricted, like permanent supportive housing and transitional housing.
So a couple ideas or thoughts, it's not really an idea, is what is the federal funds that are available, if any, to Newburgh, like for continuum of care, for funding these type of things, and what sort of vouchers does the Housing Authority have for their 2-year transitional housing vouchers, and looking at other places for the funding to help us achieve some of those goals.
And that could be something that we can bring some information back about, Melissa, to the next conversation.
I'd also like to hear more about the Housing Authority. Just a little bit about, like, if a person's in Newburgh, do they have to get to the MAC? Like, when? So is there going to be, even if it's not a navigation center, is there somewhere here that someone could get to find out, to get apply for their housing voucher or service it or talk to their caseworker? Like, do you have to go to McMinnville for that? For what I could tell from Whitecap, there's nobody in Newburgh. So I think
what you're saying is you would hope there to be some partner or some presence of the Housing Authority in Newburgh.
Otherwise, I'm concerned that those vouchers won't be moving. That the Newburgh population would be disparately impacted by their opportunity to go get those vouchers from McMinnville, and that those county resources would not be distributed in Newburgh effectively based on how many people would like to use them. If we don't have some type of satellite presence, or even a knowing how they're splitting up some of these the vouchers at that county level.
So we can talk to the Housing Authority and ask some of these questions. I don't think it's necessarily, and I could be wrong, about being physically present to get a physical voucher. I mean, we've, think things can be done on the telephone all the time. But I think the bigger question is there a difficulty in getting vouchers accepted in Newburgh? And I don't know if it's any different than in Newburgh or McMinnville. It may be that they're equally difficult to get acceptance of the vouchers. So it's what I've heard of in a lot of nicer communities where, yeah, we could give vouchers, but the landlords aren't taking them.
Well, besides that being illegal, I mean, you can't discriminate on based on source of income, although people often don't know that.
It goes back to the education.
And my question is, are we creating a rent reasonableness factor that even if they get a voucher, they're not going to find reasonable rent inside of Newburgh?
I say we ask the Housing Authority. I'm going to bet that is an issue.
They track something called the turnback rates, which I don't know if by area, but generally, that's the problem with housing authorities everywhere.
Well, why don't we talk to them? Go ahead, Doug. I think
Beth, we were going to get you off because we know you have to go to another meeting.
I have double booked myself this evening. I'm the boring person at the next meeting. It's great. If you think of any strategies that you think should be included in here, you just wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, what about the? If you'll email Mary, what we'll be doing is we'll be bringing back information about some of the about all of these. We probably won't bring back quite enough information, but that's fine. We'll figure out what we haven't brought back at the next meeting. So, thank you all for being here. Your
Thank you.
input's really helpful.
And our next meeting is on when, Mary? July 26th?
It is July 26th. Yes.
We actually gave ourselves enough time to do some of the work that we need to do between now and then.
It's like
So,
we planned that.
it was like we thought about it, I tell you. So, well, thank you all. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your thoughts.
Bye.
you.
So educational. Thank you so much. Bye.